During a brief moment of pressing silence, James could hear the rushing footsteps of the rest of the team hurry in his direction. Then, all at once, all hell broke suddenly loose. "Watch out!" Abney yelled once again, or at least James had to assume that would have been his full sentence, had the words not been swallowed by yet another deafening gunshot ripping through the air, though this time not out of his own barrel. James's eyes widened as he felt a renewed spray of warm blood hit his skin before his brain even had time to fully register the gunshot. Instinctively, he tried to veer around to the source, but his own brain forcefully ripped him out of the motion as it registered a more pressing movement coming from in front of him. There, all three bodies suddenly rose to their feet from their crouching positions, lifting up in an eerie motion that almost appeared like they were being pulled along by strings, while their heads snapped upright in sudden tension. "All of them?" James thought, as glimmering flashes in the dark, hailing from their wrist regions, informed him that each of them was similarly armed to his first attacker, while their weight shifted forwards, giving the momentum a head start for what was surely going to be a mad dash towards him. With just a slight movement of his wrist and the pull of the trigger, he managed to land a shot center of mass at the rightmost of the three, sending the ominous Augmented flying back with blood erupting from his chest, while James attempted to bring his gun around towards the next, but he was thwarted by a sudden grip hanging on tightly to the appendage, while sharp, piercing feelings buried themselves deep into his forearm and side. Howling in pain, James couldn't suppress his reflex to whip his gaze over to the attacker, only ripping his own wounds deeper in an instinctual attempt to wrench his arm free, while the very woman whose pulse he had checked just moments ago hung on tightly. He could see his own shocked face reflecting in the tinted visor of her breath filter, witnessing dark, wide eyes that clearly struggled to understand what was happening to them. But a moment later, the reflection was instantly shattered as his mechanical fist smashed into the visor, sending the woman's head careening backwards as his knuckles buried deep into the polymer with a loud crunching noise. Feeling her grip loosen, he reacted quickly, bringing his foot around with all his might and weight behind it to kick her off of him, cringing as he felt the metal spikes rip through his flesh rather than glide out smoothly. With the pain spiking as parts of his flesh were flayed by the thorn's barbs, his own grasp on his gun weakened to the point that the woman managed to hold on tight enough to pull it along out of his grip as he pushed her off, though she couldn't truly hold on to it either, and it almost immediately clattered loudly to the ground, sliding away and out of reach. Groaning his pain out once again as the woman fully tumbled to the ground, James progressively gave up on the gun and turned back just in time to see another one of his remaining attackers, both of whom had made it within less than a measure of him in the very brief time he had wrestled with the woman, meet the same fate as his predecessor when something ripped through him at blinding speed, tearing his entire body along as it shot right through him without any resistance, burying into the floor or leaving him as yet another crumpled heap on the ground. But the last one standing of the ambush didn't bat an eye, as his comrades were dropping like flies. Fighting through pain in every movement, James's arm discarded all notions of natural movement, bending around and striking like an agitated snake with bright sparks bursting from his fingertips as they shot towards the attacker's face. However, either from being slowed down by his injuries, or facing a more capable foe this time, James found himself coming up short in this duel, as his defensive strike was met by a guiding swipe, glancing his attack away, while the assassin ducked underneath the unrelenting force. Before he knew it, James's mechanical wrist was grabbed, and he was swung around in the direction of the entry hatch, stumbling a single step before he caught his footing and stopped the momentum with a decisive stance. Instead of uselessly tugging on the larger man any further, the attacker quickly let go of James's arm just before its cybernetic fingers could snake around backwards in another attempt to deliver a devastating shock. Using the momentum of that same movement, the attacker turned his body sideways and shot towards James, the thorn sprouting from his wrist, gleaming with a sinister sheen, as it aimed straight for his heart. In a flash, James realized that the earlier pull had not just been a random attempt to topple him, as he once again found himself in the line of fire between Abnir and the charging cyborg. During that same epiphany, he also knew that he was going to be hit. He wouldn't be fast enough to dodge, and in his pain, he had let his left arm sink down at his side, in no position to block. One way or another, that spike was going to pierce him. Left with no options, James decided to embrace that, putting his last effort down to a coin flip as he actually leaned into the strike. Half the time, This was most likely where James's story ended. In the other half, however. After a brief dull pressure against his chest, the by now familiar piercing pain dug deep into his flesh, and immediately James could feel the rush of blood flooding into his lung. With a gurgling cough, a red spray escaped his mouth, sprinkling the attacker and his own lips in a fine speckle of droplets, just as they raised into a victorious smile. He won. James could only imagine his attacker's face, as it was still covered by the breath filter. However, the brief hesitation of the cybernetic assassin told him more than enough as his fingers closed around cold metal. With all the force that his injured body would allow him, as his veins filled with what felt like more adrenaline than blood, James ripped the hilt of his sheath blade upwards, ramming it towards the attacker's liver in a devastating blow that briefly lifted the man off his feet in the station's low gravity. An indescribable sound escaped from the breath filter, as the man's body had no idea how to react to the sudden blow, leaving him dazed as James's right arm finally got a hold of him, firmly grabbing onto the barbed spike in his chest, as his left fully drew the blade. "I'll be taking this," he thought, but didn't actually say out loud due to the blood still flooding into his lungs, while the modified steel swung up, cleanly gliding through flesh and bone as it severed the man's hand from his arm, separating both men from each other, as the attacker toppled to the ground with a painful shriek and immediately curled up around his stump, while James tightly held onto the thorn in his lung. "Any luck and you may get it back." Although things felt like they had been going on forever, in reality, the entire exchange had taken 10, maybe 15 seconds at most. Therefore, footsteps continued running in his direction for about a breath more, as time gradually returned to its usual flow. And James just stood there, feeling the universe turn around before his mind was forced back into reality as another gush of blood forced its way out of his throat. As his lungs convulsed to push the fluid out, he could feel the bars pull and tear at his flesh, and his grip tightened even more on the weapon, determined not to let it move. "Baz!" Athena yelled out, showing off just how ingrained their use of nicknames for each other was. However, she wasn't the first one at his side, as James suddenly found his vision blocked by a dark shape appearing in front of him, his slowly dwindling awareness feeling the gentle touch of hands on his cheeks as his gaze was guided a little downwards. "James! Fuck!" Admir said, his brown eyes opened wide as they stared up at James's face with a wet glimmer, studying his face briefly, before immediately looking down to inspect the thorn stabbed into his upper chest. "What happened?" Feeling a bit loopy, James's lips curled into a smile again, as he laughed out a small spray of blood with a single amused huff. "I called heads," he replied, with slightly intoxicated humour. Glancing down at himself as well, he saw the spreading stain of dark wetness creeping across his chest, slowly growing larger around the metal spike stuck in his flesh moment by moment, along with the red stuff leaking out of his various other large wounds. However, that wasn't what his eyes were focusing on. Just looking at it superficially, one may have assumed that the attacker simply missed his mark in aiming for James's heart, ending up in the top of his lungs, instead for a simple mistake or good fortune. If they looked a little closer, however, they would find that his uniform was indeed pierced around the space above his heart, only for the hole in the fabric to then glance upwards, ripping and cutting through his jacket and shirt for about 2 inches, before finally finding purchase and sinking into soft flesh right where the metal spike down resided. Maybe his odds had actually been slightly worse than a coin flip, with the way he had to lean forwards, but either way, in a worse timeline, the spike may have very well glanced off in a different direction as it hit the weights strapped to his chest, which were meant to balance out the additional weight of his mechanical arm for the benefit of his spine, very likely then piercing something far more important than just the very tip of one of his lungs in the process. Admir took all of that in as he stared at James's chest as well, his eyes quivering slightly in their sockets as every bit of information gradually sunk in for the lieutenant, reconstructing the exchange's events in his mind. Ultimately, he released a shuddering exhale before his head dropped forwards to lean against James's chest, though obviously very careful to not accidentally nudge against the spike in any way in the process. Admir didn't seem to care one bit about the spray of blood slowly speckling his neck and back from both James's breath and the still very much attached severed hand of the assassin, as he remained like that, not saying another word. Without really thinking about it, James dropped his sword with a loud clatter, lifting his thus freed hand to gently place it on Admir's shoulder in a reassuring manner. Vaguely, he was aware of other things happening around him, like Athena and Tuya dashing to the two remaining ambushers, who were at least presumably alive, and Andrzej loudly talking to someone just a few steps away, though, strangely, the words he said just wouldn't quite register to James, even though he clearly heard them. How odd. He had lost a lot of blood before. Usually he didn't get this loopy this quickly, did he? He blacked out for other reasons sometimes, but if that happened, he wasn't this woozy. Oh, right. Those guys had super slow heartbeats. It was why he hadn't realized they were awake when checking them. Probably something in their blood, huh? That was all over those spikes, after all. Actually, maybe those were poisoned, weren't they? Probably. Huh. What a thought to have right now. Ha ha! Brother Abbott exclaimed in great amusement, clapping his hands together while throwing his weight back away from the screen a bit, as his energy seemingly needed some form of release through his sudden onslaught of irrational joy. He showed those sinners the fast way to paradise. My lord, what a sight. Truly the best saint we have had in a long, long time. He turned his head around to Alexander, grinning so widely that his brittle lips were cracking open in multiple, gently bleeding tears. Reaching up, he even patted against the guy's lower hip, almost as if he wanted to congratulate Alexander for being the one to have anointed such a good saint. Alexander, however, hardly reacted to the brother's unsightly display, apart from a brief, displeased glance down at him. Instead, his eyes remained almost glued onto the screen, watching enraptured as the saint stood proud next to the bodies. Even now he reached out to others in sympathy. Even as he stood bloody and flayed, a dagger in his heart and death in his veins, his spirit was with those around him. Alexander's hand reached up to the pendant around his neck, trembling as it clenched shut, with blood immediately dripping out from his fist as sharp corners pierced his flesh from his iron grip. Still not enough, he reached his other hand up as well, closing it around the first, though it wasn't enough to quell the trembling as he observed how the saint actually managed to be guided out of the cellar on his own 2 feet, leaving the camera's view with nothing but the corpses he left in his wake. Brother Abbott was still snickering and clapped his hands once again in a macabre applause as Alexander lowered his gaze down to him. A bit of fog had started to spread over his mind, causing his usually far more well-planned manner of speaking to briefly slip, as he very bluntly asked, "How is he still standing?" Brother Abbott's snicker very gradually died down as he reached up to his mouth, the dry skin of his hand straining dangerously against his movements, as he rubbed his fingers along his exposed cheeks and chin. "Hard to say, really. Considering the dose he must have taken there, most people would definitely be wiped," he replied, and his voice almost sounded like he was pondering the most enticing curiosity as he spoke. His mouth shifted into a thoughtful pursing of his bloody lips, and his eyes briefly glanced around the room in pontification. Finally, he pulled his hand down from his rubbing, and instead tapped his right index finger against his jaw. "Well, truth be told, the venom can't be completely lethal." He seemed to ultimately land on his answer to the riddle. "If it was, the sinners would just themselves with their own weapons, you know," he explained, blowing a sick-sounding raspberry and moving his fingers across his neck to indicate an early end of their life. "There is certainly a way to immunize that isn't all that different from other kinds of poisons and venoms, you know." He opened his hand and held it out flatly, almost like the answer was a physical thing he was offering to the guide. Alexander released a deep, raspy exhale of pure displeasure as he glared down at the brother. "And just how would he know about those?" he asked, in a rare moment of unrestrained anger. The question came from somewhere deep within him and wasn't born out of any rational desire to know. Brother Abbott seemed to pick up on that as he turned his head to fully gaze up at his much younger superior. For a brief moment, a flicker of hilarity entered his eyes, though he didn't fully allow it to emerge, as he simply supported his weight by leaning his arm down onto his thigh, and looked up with a suppressed smile. "Well, he was a geneticist first, saint second," the brother reminded Alexander, in a tone that sounded very casual, but the guide could feel the scathing criticism hiding just underneath it. All heavily stained with the particular brother's morbid amusement. Maybe he isn't taking chances with poisons. If he possibly prepared himself for something much stronger that works in a similar manner. Alexander's higher thinking was still impaired by the rush of emotion flowing through him, though thankfully the pain in his hand kept him somewhat grounded as he digested the lecture from the older brother slowly. "You think he has made himself?" he began to reply, the words forming only slowly in his mind. Seemingly not blessed with the patience to wait for him to fully realize his thoughts, Abbott intuited the rest of his sentence and cut him off. However, instead of giving a straight answer, he smiled a little wilder and narrowed his eyes at Alexander. For a moment, it truly seemed like he didn't see his guide standing in front of him. Instead, he seemed to fully witness a younger friar in need of wisdom, as he crossed his legs and pushed his body up with his arms to fully shift it to face Alexander. "Do you think that would be outside of his capabilities?" he asked in a candid tone, very clearly intended to not suggest any answer, even if the question and context themselves very much did. Or his willingness? Alexander couldn't help but look at the now still screen once again, as the question replayed in his mind. At the word capabilities, his mind recalled the almost lightning-fast exchange that left the saint on his feet, and 6 others dead or dying. Of course, he technically had help, but that hardly mattered right now. As the word willingness came back to him, he once again saw the saint reach out, comforting his brother in arms, even as he slowly bled out. "You said he is the best saint in a long time," he wondered aloud, his eyes sticking to the dead bodies on the screen as if they were glue. A strange feeling was settling in his stomach, causing him to grip the star-framed cross even tighter, despite the severe pain it caused him at this point. "Don't you think so?" Brother Abbott gave back right away, his posture loosening a bit as he somewhat untangled his legs to lean back slightly, allowing him to also glance at the screen. "He almost reminds me of the legends of old. Saint Benedict, Saint Boniface, Saint Andrew." Alexander's eyes shot down at the brother and narrowed dangerously. "You are speaking threateningly close to worship, brother," the guide warned the haggard man. However, Abbott's look of superiority by no means disappeared, as he returned Alexander's glare with a gaze that was so casual that it almost felt belittling of the warning. "How are you going to lead the strayed off the saint's dangerous path if you don't know why they follow him in the first place?" he countered, lifting his hand to open it in a questioning gesture. Then he instead moved it towards the screen. "Look at him," he said, even though there was no sign of the saint on the screen anymore. Clearly the gesture was mostly symbolic. "Does he seem like someone who anyone could safely follow? Seeing what you have seen, how many of the flock do you think could brave the path he walks?" He brought his hand down to his knee again, and coldly looked into Alexander's eyes. "You were the one who anointed him, Guide Page," he reminded, his tone now turning serious but not harsh. "And during your speech you let everyone know exactly why you did it." Brother Abbott closed his eyes and cleared his throat briefly. "Sanctity is a dangerous path," he then quoted directly. "The saints walk it, and they invite all who will to follow. They do not warn them of the danger. In fact, they encourage all to face it. Proclaiming their path as is the right one, they tell all who follow not to stray from it, no matter the danger. It is a dangerous thing indeed, such a saint." He paused and opened his eyes again, once again seeking Alexander's gaze. Alexander's eyes had widened as he listened to the man recite his own speech word for word, without so much as stuttering. "Saint Aldwyn believes himself to walk the right path, and nothing is holy to him, either on earth nor in heaven, man-made or God-given. but that which allows him to follow it," he began to say along with Abbott, the words coming back to him as if the Lord himself whispered them into his mind. "He believes himself to be a protector, a shepherd, a savior." Although it wasn't part of the quote, Alexander added one more thing on, before they both stopped speaking. "The danger is the nature of a saint." His gaze had entirely calmed, and his hand had slowly loosened his vice grip on his pendant, allowing the blood to flow out of the punctures in his palm, and fingers more freely than before, staining the coolest floor with a slowly growing red puddle, much like the one still visible on the screen, even if much, much smaller. "You know my speech word for word?" he asked, still processing things a bit as he looked down at Brother Abbott. "I have a lot of free time here," the brother replied, and pulled the scarf that loosely hung around his neck back over his face to cover it. Alexander couldn't help but smile a bit at the almost sheepish-seeming gesture. Abbott glanced up at him one last time before he fully turned back to his screens and keyboard to gather information on what was happening on the station in response to all the chaos that had occurred. "Are you afraid of the saint, Guy Page?" he asked outright, while leaning down to give his attention to his true love before it could feel left out. Alexander released a single scoff. "Afraid? I am terrified," he admitted without shame. The mere thought of ever meeting that man face to face, sending shivers chasing each other down his spine. At this point, he wasn't sure if he trusted a wall of tempered glass between him and those hands that were just as fast to strike you down as they were to reach out in friendship. The Lord was his strength and his shield, his shepherd. But Alexander doubted he would reach out a protective hand if he walked right into the walt's open maw. Abbott went back to his earlier snickering, slipping right back into his amusement now that the lecture had passed. "Yes, I doubt any of us would last more than a few seconds in an outright brawl," he agreed, as his fingers moved to skilled clicking on the keyboard, finally dispelling the view of the corpses as he instead summoned multiple data streams across his windows into the cyberspace, which were far less insightful to the uninitiated such as Alexander. "Speak for yourself," a loud voice cut through the room, causing Alexander to turn in its owner's direction, while Abbott remained entirely focused on his work, though he scoffed at the comment. "Pride is a sin, Brother Anders," he reminded, while turning his gaze at the larger man, who stepped into the caller with a slow, confident gait. Anders' muscular arms stretched out the sleeves of his robe slightly as he crossed them in front of his chest, throwing a slightly disapproving look at the crouching friar. Truly, the man had good right to be confident and content with himself, sporting a remarkable physique despite being the oldest of the friars around, and more than twice Alexander's age, though the thinning and greying hair was the only blemish in his otherwise still youthful appearance. However, even with that in mind, Alexander wasn't quite so sure what to make of the brother's announcement, much like Brother Abbott seemed to be. After all, Anders had not seen what they just had, after the plan had so spontaneously changed. Anders, however, seemed undeterred by their doubting words and gazes as he faced the guide, giving a brief bow before speaking directly. "I take it from your demeanor that the sinners have failed," he surmised directly, his eyes briefly flicking down to Alexander's bleeding hand. He briefly reached into his robe, producing gauze and bandages from an unseen pocket, and quickly ripping the sterilizing bags open before holding his hand open in a beckon to Alexander. "I don't think that is quite a reason for self-flagellation yet," Anders said with a warmer tone. Alexander sighed briefly, but did not hesitate to offer his hand to the man to have his self-inflicted wounds addressed. Although Anders' grasp was quite firm, the large man moved with remarkable tenderness whenever he actually came into contact with the injury. "For now we cannot be quite sure if they failed," he replied at first, focusing his mind on his words so he wouldn't wince while soft pressure was applied to his tender flesh. "But it's fair to assume he's going to yet again avoid the pearly gates." Usually, he wouldn't have much cared about showing any weakness, especially not to his closest subordinates. However, after what he had observed moments ago, something about wincing at this mild inconvenience he brought upon himself felt wrong. He snapped up as he caught himself in the thought, so quickly that Anders briefly froze, obviously believing he had inflicted some sort of greater pain. Not really reacting to that, Alexander froze briefly as well, almost shocked at himself for a moment. However then, he chuckled slightly and shook his head. "Lord have mercy," he said under his breath, before scrunching up his face at the pain in his hand, or nodding to Anders to keep going. "Is it that bad?" Anders asked with clear sympathy, immediately loosening his grip even more as he continued with the treatment. Alexander shook his head. "No," he replied, still feeling his heart beat a little bit uneasy at everything that had just happened. "I just got a reminder how easy it is to stumble." Brother Anders nodded and soon finished up the bandaging. Alexander opened and closed his hand a few times to test it for mobility and any possible strangulation. "We are all but men," Brother Anders assured him in the meantime. When Alexander finally lowered his hand and looked back at him, the old man had a thoughtful expression on his face. "One way or another, the sinners have done their part," he said first, his hand shifting a bit uncomfortably along his bicep as he once again crossed his arms. "It is on us to make sure that their efforts are not wasted." Alexander immediately picked up on the change in the man's tone, and his heart briefly sank. "Your way is your own, brother," he stated outright, returning to his position as the guide as he raised his head to stand at his full height. "I can help lead you on your path to heaven, but the path itself is between you and the Lord alone." Brother Anders nodded, and his right hand briefly tightened around his arm. "You know I know better of your wisdom than anybody else, Alexander." Anders began to justify himself, but Alexander lifted his hand to stop him. His tongue almost refused its service as he spoke. However, he knew what he had to say, and he wasn't going to deny his duty. "Just tell me what you need, and I shall provide what I can," he offered openly, firming his tone in a way that wouldn't take avoidance for an answer. "You are capable and stronger in your faith than any other. I have no wisdom that could guide you to a better path than your own." Anders nodded. He didn't seem to be happy about it. He did, however, appear satisfied. "Allow me to face our dragon," he then requested directly, his eyes and Alexander's forming a firm connection as he spoke. "I will follow your guidance and shan't stray from the safe path you unveil. However, as the Lord intended, my path is not one of allowing others to save me." Alexander swallowed at Anders' words. "There are no saviors," he confirmed, forcing his gaze to not falter as he returned to that of the friar. "You shall have your path," he then said, clenching both hands, his freshly bandaged wounds flaring up in pain. "I will guide you to the best of my ability. May it lead you true, and may your way to paradise be a long one." Finally, Anders broke their eye contact as he bowed. "Amen, Guide Page," he said, with audible gratitude and trepidation. As he looked up again, there was a hint of a glimmer in his eyes. "If you will excuse me." Without another word, Anders turned and walked out of the cooler. Alexander knew that the man would retire to a private space to pray. The brother would never be so insolent to boast about his prayer, of course, only doing so in absolute privacy. However, Alexander knew him well enough to know of his habits, even if he had just occasionally caught glimpses of them. "You have your work cut out for you." Brother Abba's voice suddenly pulled Alexander out of his thoughts, after the man had been quiet during his entire conversation with Anders. Alexander sighed deeply. All sorts of replies were burning on his lips, some more appropriate than others. However, in the end, he defenstrated them all, and in their stead, he merely uttered, "Amen." With her thumb stroking gently across the bandaged skin of James's hand, as she held it in one of her own, Sheeda leaned against the headboard of the hospital bed, while she looked down at the device he held in her other hand. With an empty gaze, she watched as numbers slowly ticked down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The long row of numbers turned red as the last of its digits switched into a 0, which in turn caused all of the many, previously constantly shifting numbers underneath it to freeze, as they were in that moment, before they then also lit up in either a bright green or a deep red. With her thumb, she began to wipe upward across the screen, causing it to quickly scroll along many of the coloured numbers, the vast majority of which had turned red with just a few greens in between. In all honesty, she didn't really need to check. The numbers had been painting a pretty clear picture for the last few days already, and it was very doubtful, if not impossible, that anything about that had changed since this morning. Still, she wanted to see it with her own eyes. Eventually, she found the name. James Aldwin. Spelled out in GU script, it was pretty far down the alphabet, so she had to scroll a bit. She stopped at just the name briefly, before scrolling a bit further down, revealing the number underneath it. 6 350 826 307 549, it read, in bright green letters. Damn, the galaxy was larger than she had thought. With a slow exhale, she turned her head to look at James, laying peacefully with his eyes closed, while his chest very slowly rose and sank all on its own. Slowly, she set her phone down onto the white sheet before leaning in, bringing her cheek to his while moving her arm around to gently caress his other cheek with her palm. "Congratulations, councilman," she said quietly as she nuzzled up to him. She quickly licked across his cheek before pulling away again. He really did look peaceful. "I don't think anybody's going to arrest you as you are now," she mused with mild amusement, remembering the promise James had made while scanning his injuries up and down. He would probably have to wait a bit before he would be able to make good on that. "And you're going to miss your inauguration." She said that last part with mild, playful scolding. Who knew? Maybe he would hear her. Though, according to the doctors, he wasn't going to be out all too long. Whatever treatment they had given him, he was taking to it remarkably well, they said. He was just put under to give his body some time to recover in peace. With a hiss and a whoosh, the door to the medbay opened, and Sheila didn't have to turn around to know whose clacking footsteps were entering there, along with 3 pairs of more quiet yet equally familiar ones. "That's another hurdle passed," Admiral Krieger said, as she came walking up to the bed, along with her brother and her daughter, as well as an old family friend in tow. Sheila looked at James for a moment longer before finally glancing up at all 3. The Admiral's gaze was one of mild worry as she looked down at James, though that was obviously only the part that she allowed to show. "Not looking forward to my next turn on the carousel of hospital beds?" Nia joked, as she sank down on the other side of James's bed, putting a hand onto James's mechanical arm. "Who knows? Now that I'm here, maybe I'm about to cut in line," Finn commented against that, while pulling up a chair that stood opposite of the bed, sitting down on it the wrong way around, with his legs on both sides of the backrest. Making the full round around the bed as the only one, Coco stepped up to Sheida and gently put a hand onto the feline's shoulder, causing Sheida's ears to twitch mildly. "You should get some sleep," Coco gently suggested, while putting just the slightest pull onto her shoulder to try and make her get up. And, in what may have been to Coco's surprise, Sheida complied quite quickly, giving James's hand one more quick stroke before getting to her feet. Moving her eyes off her boyfriend, she looked at Coco with a gentle, tired expression on her face. "Keep me some company?" she requested softly, without being pushy. She knew the commander may be busy at such a time. And besides that, she hadn't had her own chance to see James yet. However, Coco smiled and nodded, moving her hand down from Sheida's shoulder and behind her back as she began to lead her around, moving out to leave the Aldwin Krieger Subira family to themselves for a bit.